I know all you guys are not here for me, so I would love to welcome to the stage Justin of the Sky Blues or Sydney FC. I think they will definitely rock the A-League this year, and he will give you an exciting presentation about how they are actually doing the football analysis at the other side of the ocean. So Justin, the floor is all yours.
Sorry, my apologies there for a moment. I just want to say thank you for the introduction first and foremost, and I'd like to express my gratitude to the whole Sky Sports team for having me involved. And also to everyone at home, I hope you're all staying safe and healthy at this time, and I'm looking forward to the opportunity to see us all back on the pitch very, very soon. So for my presentation today, I'll just bring the slides up now. Okay, just bring those back. Okay. So for my presentation today, first and foremost, I'd like to give a little bit of context regarding the A-League itself. It's an incredibly unique competition, and the rules and regulations surrounding it really govern what we can and can't do as far as our transfer policy goes. And then secondly, I'd like to talk about the role that I then have to have within that recruitment process. After that, I'm going to talk a little bit about some concepts that we found to be particularly interesting within the A-League as far as recruitment goes, and then ultimately talk a little bit about accountability within the recruitment process. I'll just move forward. These slides are taking their time, sorry. Okay, so first and foremost, in terms of the A-League itself, it's quite a young competition. The first season was 2005-06, so it's about 15 years old. The first thing that's kind of unique about it is that we have 3 domestic competitions that we compete in. So we have our league title, our premiership, like all leagues do around the world. We have our domestic cup. We also have a grand final, which for those who are less initiated is a little bit like the playoff system in England, with the exception that it occurs with the top 6 teams in the competition and culminates in a playoff game referred to as the grand final for the championship. And they're considered the 2 major trophies, the league and the championship. Sydney FC itself has been the most successful club in the A-League era. We've won 2 of the last 3 premierships and championships and are currently 8 points clear in the league at the time of everything being paused, obviously. And we haven't had the final series yet, but things are going quite smoothly. Now, in terms of understanding the rules and regulations surrounding the league, I referred to the fact that we have some unique rules and regulations, and the primary one would be the salary cap. So the salary cap is a concept that will be familiar to some. We have it in the A-League. It's also seen in the MLS, in the US. But the big difference that we have in Australia is that we have what's referred to as a hard cap. And a hard cap essentially means that it's in place every day of the year. It includes everything from agent fees to transfer fees to some relocation costs. And the one exemption that we really get is for player loyalty. So in simplistic terms, we basically have $3.2 million Australian to spend per year on our squad, with a 90% cap floor, which means every team is required to spend $2.88 million. And as you can see from that diagram already, that means there's only a $320,000 difference between a team that spends the full cap and a team that spends the floor of the cap. So it's quite a congested competition. We're only allowed to have 5 foreigners, and you're allowed to have 2 players that are exempt from the salary cap. They're referred in our competition as marquee players. So that effectively means we can spend $3.2 million plus 2 marquee players. A couple of other considerations to have for recruitment in Australia is that we have no professional second division. So we have a series of state leagues that ultimately come together under the banner of the National Premier League. And there really hasn't been an example in the past of a player coming from the National Premier Leagues and being a sort of top tier, high level A-League player and being really, really successful, although a lot of squad players come from there. In addition to that, we have no domestic transfer fees, which as far as I understand is pretty much unique around the world. So what that results in is most players, if they're looking to increase the size of their contract over time, as a lot of players do, they invariably will take very short-term deals in Australia. So they'll often sign for 1 year, at most 2 years. And it means that it's not uncommon for a player to move between sort of 4, 5 or 6 clubs within their career. So it's a highly transient population. About 50% of all players at any given time are coming off contract at the end of that season, which means that the bulk of our recruitment really occurs looking at domestic free agency. The other thing that we've noticed in the last couple of years specifically is that Australia is becoming an emerging market for player sales. So since Aaron Moy went over to England and was quite successful, we've seen more and more players be sold. So in the last 2 years for us, we've sold the top scorer in the league, Bobo, the player of the season, Adrian Mirzaevski, to Turkey and to China respectively. We've sold Australian international Brandon O'Neill and recently sold 2 of our under-17s national team players, including the captain, Ryan Teague. So that's something that's really changed in the last couple of years. Now, in terms of going about the recruitment process, the role of the analysis department at Sydney is not particularly unique. It would be the same as it would happen to a lot of other clubs. But what is unique is how strictly we're governed by the overarching club philosophy. It's something I've noticed more than anywhere else that I've been, really. We have a really long-term philosophy at the club. You're not going to see a coach come in and eliminate 10 players from the squad and replace them. It really is a long-term idea. And that philosophy includes a very distinct style of play. That includes very detailed player profiles from the head coach. So we're never going to see the club put us in a position as analysts where they would say, we want a number 9 and leave it at that. It would be ultra specific about the types of runs that they would make, the sorts of areas that we would want them in, the sorts of chances that we expect them to take relative to what's created in our style of play. And we're also given an incredibly detailed budgetary outline because of the nature of the salary cap. Every dollar is really, really important. So as far as the recruiting process goes, obviously all the data and video side of things in terms of wider scouting comes through myself and my team. And then anything sort of external to that, whether it be agents or clubs looking to do a deal, generally go to our player recruitment manager, Paul Reed. And previously they would have gone to our former head of general operations for the football department, Terry McFlynn, who'd be familiar to a lot of our listeners in England. And then when all those players are compiled, using that sort of detailed player profile that we have, we can really shorten it up quite quickly and come up with shortlists to present to our head coach, Steve Corica. So our head coach likes to have a wide variety of information on players, and that ranges from everything to where the player's football education was, where they've travelled around the world and languages they speak. Injury information is really important to us because of the restrictive nature of transfers in the A-League. It's hard for us to replace players once they become injured. And then ultimately, when we look at video and data and that side of things, I like to keep things a little bit more general at first, just for the sake of giving an overview of the player. And then obviously we get into much more detail regarding specific tactical concepts or detailed data projections of where the player would fit in our system. So when it comes to a couple of recruitment concepts, I've decided to split things down the line of domestic transfers and international transfers. And the reason for that is, as I've already detailed, a huge amount of recruitment in our league comes from domestic free agency, which is relatively unique. And as a result of that, you kind of have this situation where every club in the league is effectively looking at the same players, which is probably a little bit different to what would happen around the world otherwise. And the first thing that I'm sort of want to talk about is this idea of value within our budget. And I think that's something that's not necessarily unique. I think everyone's trying to do that regardless of what your club's budget is. You want to get the most value for it. But what I've found in our specific situation is there's a real clear difference between what I would term absolute and relative value. So absolute value for a player, in my estimation, would be in the traditional Moneyball concept. You see a player who's on, say, $100,000, but they're performing statistically in a way that you would equate to $150,000 or $200,000. So it makes effective fiscal sense to bring that player in and have them perform above that perceived market value. But because everyone's looking at the same players in Australia, it's pretty much impossible to find a player who's undervalued by everyone in the market. It doesn't really happen that way. So where we get more value is in a relative sense. And what I mean by that is by having a really clear and distinct style of play, it becomes much easier as a data analyst to project how a player would perform in your system. Now, a hypothetical example would be if you were a team that played with 2 wingers that were really good one-on-one and delivered great crosses, for a single number 9, a single striker, and you found a really tall striker who was great in the air at a rival team that didn't play any crosses. So that player is probably underperforming at that club because they don't really suit him. Whereas if he came to your team, he may perform much higher than his perceived market value at a given time. The second thing that we do really effectively, I find at the club, is communication between the departments. So I think as data analysts, it's very common for us to think that we have all the answers because we process so much information, but we have to be open to the idea that we really don't know everything, and there are people around our clubs that know a lot more about specific areas than we do. As an example, there was a midfield player that we were looking at last year who, from a technical on-the-ball standpoint, was unbelievable from my perspective. But there was a perceived issue in the data relative to their work rate and physical capacity. So for me, it was a simple matter of speaking to our head of high performance, speaking to our strength and conditioning staff who are outstanding, and getting a detailed picture of where they felt that player's capabilities were within our system. And as a result, they were able to alleviate any doubts and allow me to put forward a positive case for a transfer there. The third thing that's really specific about our club is culture. And I guess it's not unique to talk about club culture, but I've never seen an environment that is so specific in the idea of ending transfer discussion on the spot on the basis of a character reference. The advantage of that sort of style for us is that we have players who are generally really well matched personality-wise. Players tend to sign long-term deals at the club, and we have a real continuity of idea, continuity of tactics, and that also does give us salary cap breaks as well in the long run. And the last thing there to mention briefly is the academy. We're fortunate to have a great academy at this time, and that's meant that in the last 2 years we've been able to debut 11 players, which is just remarkable. If anything, the guys are producing them faster than we can actually put them in the first team, which is really, really wonderful. So if we look at international transfers a little bit more specifically, international transfers are a difficult one, I think, as far as Australia goes, because again, with the nature of transfers, we can't really get them wrong. We can only get those 5 players in. Our budgets are incredibly restrictive. So if a player were to go down or not be successful, then it would present a huge problem for us. And the first thing that I've sort of found to be incredibly useful here is doing detailed modeling around your league specifically. So identifying what makes your league unique. In the situation that we have in Australia, it's a really physically demanding league. I've had a lot of foreigners tell me that it's the most difficult league they've played in, and these are guys who've played in the English Premier League, for example. But the reasons around that are numerous. The main thing being that we play in summer, and in Australia, if anyone's been out here, summer gets really hot. We also travel long distances by plane because it's a large country. We play on hard pitches. And if we think about the general international perception of Australia, our players are generally physically really good. Our sports science is really advanced here, probably to a higher level than the technical football is, even though that's quite good, but our physical capacity is very high. So the games are played over large distances. They're played at a very, very high tempo. So if you were to hypothetically try and sign a number 10 in Australia who didn't do any defensive work, in order to find someone who was that effective that they wouldn't need to do any physical work, their cost would already be out of the range of the salary cap. So that wouldn't really be possible. To give a simple example of what this might look like in practice, I'm going to talk about Ryan McGowan, who's central defender for our team that we recruited for this season. He is Australian, but he'd never previously played in the A-League. He had spent, he basically moved as a young player to Scotland and spent the year previous to coming here playing at Bradford and at Dundee. So obviously it's a little bit simplistic to use just basic pass data, basic challenge data, but to demonstrate the concept, you can see in that table on the left really clearly that there's a distinct style difference between all 3 leagues. So that's basically looking at the average number of those actions that occur per 90 minutes in a typical game. And you can see that the A-League, in sort of layman's terms, is a little bit more possession-based, a little bit less challenge-heavy. And as a result, you need to take that into account when it comes to recruiting those players. If you look at the values on the right, they're Ryan's typical 90 minutes in any of those leagues. And on face value, if we had a look at our league, what you would find is that a player who performs that many challenges and that successfully might suit our profile for a central defender, but a player who's not able to complete more than 60% of his passes wouldn't really be what we were looking for. But if you can have a look at the difference between the leagues, it becomes quite obvious that in a more possession-based environment, in a team that plays with more possession, is a little bit less direct, that those numbers would go up, the number of challenges would go down, but his success coming from that sort of league might actually improve. And if you have a look at those values there, that's effectively what happens. And then finally, if we have a look at moving across to KPIs, I think it's important under any circumstances to really talk about your work and be really open with yourself in terms of recruitment. So I think the obvious subjective thing to do in that sense would be to basically say, let's have a look at the players that we have recruited and see if they've been successful. The only problem with that, in my opinion, or in my findings over the last couple of years, is that if you're only recruiting a few players per season, it's too small a sample size, really. Looking at 3 players and using that to assess your process probably isn't detailed enough. So what I've started to do as a habit, which I find to be quite useful and I'd sort of recommend to everyone, is that any player that I've shortlisted out of the 1,000 or so that we look at each year, I then perform detailed projections and analyze what those players have done. Because you can find sometimes you may recruit 3 players and they go really well, but you might have also shortlisted 20 other players and 10 of them may have performed really poorly in the following season. And that requires you to modify any models that you do have. Even if players that you've recruited have outperformed your expectation, that again requires you to change any projections that you do have. So that's pretty much it from me. Thank you to everyone. I'm going to leave the slide there with my email. So if we don't get to some questions in the Q&A, please feel free to email me or get in touch. And again, thank you to everyone for watching.
Thank you, Justin, for your wonderful presentation. We did have some questions coming in from all over the world. So it was also especially cool how you said what the differences were between finding the undervalued players at other leagues. And we also have some questions about that. But the first question I want to put on stage is actually a question from Jamie, and that's the following question. How do you actually convince foreign players to come to your team?
Oh, that's it's an interesting one. Fortunately, it's not something that I generally have to do in terms of specific discussions with the players, but I think Australia is generally an easy sell for players in the sense that the lifestyle here is wonderful. It's a beautiful country, so people are quite willing to come here. Generally, for the really top foreign players, it's more towards the end of their career when they want to experience something different and come to a different part of the world. But yeah, that's our discussion. Isn't something that specifically I have to do so much. My job is more to convince people to then speak to the players.
And it's probably also helping in that case that you had some players coming from really good clubs, and of course Del Piero, Sim de Jong, they all played in your team, and if you show the results of your team in the current season, that probably helps as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Sydney, we're very fortunate with where we are, and we have had really good players, as you mentioned, like Del Piero and Sim de Jong come before, and I think that sort of sets a precedent for other players. It's not uncommon for them when they hear about the club or they research the club to then go, oh, Del Piero played there, or Sim de Jong's played there, or Adam Lafondra has played there, and then have more of an inclination to come and join us, which is nice.
Yeah, thanks. And I have a question from Challenge. And what are the advantages or disadvantages of having a top division in Australia with lesser teams compared to European top divisions with more teams in terms of scouting and recruitment?
That's a really good question. Gee, where to take that one? I think the advantage, I guess, from a sort of tactical point of view, is that you understand all your opposition really well, because at the moment we basically play everyone 3 times, generally speaking, during the domestic season. So the level of familiarity between all the teams is really high, which I guess some people would say is a disadvantage as well, because everyone knows you well. As far as recruitment goes, I think it makes it tough because, like I mentioned before, we have a relatively small pool of domestic Australian players within the league. But it means that everyone's looking at the same players. So if we have, 12 clubs in the league at the moment, and there's a really good central midfielder coming off contract, you can guarantee that all 12 clubs have looked at them. There's no real difference in the approach of teams in that sense. We're all looking at the same people. If there was a lot more teams and a lot of levels and divisions, then I think that would separate everything a little bit and allow you to have your niche for recruitment.
Yeah, cool. And I think also we had a chat offline already on this topic together. But I think
Yes.
I have one last question, and you already touched upon it during your presentation, but I think it's really interesting for other people if you can elaborate a little bit more on this topic. It's a question of Sancho, and he basically asked, how do you quantify a successful signing? And you touched upon it already a little bit in your presentation, but you were also mentioning that you were looking for the players that are underperforming at other clubs, and how you translate that to your own club.
Yes. Yeah, I think this one's interesting because there's always that subjective way of looking at it. But if we want to be really objective and we want to quantify it, I think the best way of doing it is to say, if we look at the player that we replace in that position and we look at the output of that player, we want any player that we bring in to have greater performance outcomes in an objective sense than that player did. So if we take that in simplistic terms and we look at a striker, and if we wanted to be reductionist and simplify it down to just goals, we say the last guy scored 12 and this guy scored 15, then in an objective sense, he's outperformed the other one. And then I think you can extend that logic to pretty much everything else. So if you have a look at a player and a style of play and say, these are the numbers that they put up, if we're going to spend the same amount of money, hypothetically, we get better value if the new player.
But can you also use that in quantifying the influence of a player in the dressing room, for instance?
It's harder. It's harder, definitely. I guess the best way of looking at that would be simply to say that when that player performs, how do they affect the metrics of everybody else, which is something that comes down to a wider set of metrics, like the stuff that you guys do at Sci Sports. So there's certainly more difficult things to quantify in terms of our dressing room, but fortunately for us, we have a really, really good dressing room, and I think everyone makes everyone else better.
Thanks for being here, Justin. I know they call you the night owl of the Sky Blues, but still it's already past midnight for you. Feel free to stay here, but also feel free to go to your bed. But it's a pleasure to have you here. So thanks a lot for your presentation.